So I'd like to welcome our participants in this panel, Governance and Societies in the Pandemic, a Global Perspective. I'm Mark Thompson from neighboring City University of Hong Kong. So at the beginning, we have a video presentation coming to us direct from France, from Lyon, if I understand it. A video presentation. David Vallat is as a professor at Sciences Po Lyon, and the other presenter is Professor Philippe Michel, who's the head of the University Hospital in Lyon. And they are speaking on the resilience of hospitals in the COVID-19 crisis, experiences from 4 French hospitals. So take it away, Philippe and David, via video.
The COVID-19 epidemic was qualified by the World Health Organization as a pandemic on March 11, 2020. In this context, a complete mobilization of the French health system was operated based on very precise contingency plans. The scale, intensity, duration, and the societal impact of the COVID-19 pandemic make it a completely unprecedented event. This crisis clearly revealed the limits of the risk management approach, which considers crises as isolated events that can be analyzed as linear chains of causes and consequences, consequences leading to the implementation of adaptation and prevention measures. My colleague, Philippe Michel, and I, David Vallat, have prepared a presentation of the first finding of the coping study. First, let's talk about the COVID pandemic institutional management study. The coping study is a 2-year research action program funded by the French Ministry of Health. It involved directly more than 20 researchers and practitioners in 4 universities. And the second largest university hospital in France, namely Hospice Civil de Lyon, is leading the research. At the moment, we are at the 3rd stage of the research. We have realized more than 200 interviews with practitioners in 4 university hospitals: Lyon, Saint-Étienne, Grenoble, and Clermont-Ferrand. We have not yet analyzed all the more than 200 interviews, but we are able to present you some key points emerging from these interviews. So we are going to present you now the problems during the first wave, and after we will see the problems during the second wave, and after that some solutions. So during the first wave, people pointed out the question of deprogramming of many activities, medical examination, elective surgery, which of course lead to some health issues for patients. We have been told also about the exhaustion of health workers because of the lot of pressure, because of the anguish of being infected. Another problem which has been pointed out is about unclear political and medical expert communication at the national level, which led to discrepancies between national directives and available tools on the field, and also which led to discrepancies between vision of the management and the realities of the field. All that generated tension between centralization and decentralization in decision making. We also have been told about failure of health democracy. It was very difficult for patients to express what they were feeling at the moment. We can underline also some pressure on middle management which has been exacerbated by the difficulty of managing from a distance because of teleworking. People told us also about the question of information overload and insufficient horizontal and vertical communication. People also told us about some problem in the supply chains, being able to have in time protective equipment, respirators, drugs, and so on, at the start of the pandemic. After the people dealt with this problem, but at the start it was an issue. And to finish, some people told us about the fact that reinforcements were not always very useful. Because of the duration of the crisis, other problems emerged after the first wave, during the second wave from September 2020. The first one was the fact that no real crisis exit strategy have been implemented. How to deal with the exhaustion of health workers after the first wave. No one knows. It was the first time hospitals have to deal with this kind of problem. Maybe one reason why it occurred is because no systematic lesson learned workshops in the university hospitals have been implemented. And one reason is maybe the decrease in the availability and motivation of staff, because people were exhausted. And more generally, we have been told about the fact that people trusted less and less the government and experts at national level. In order to deal with all these problems, some solutions have been experimented on the field. For example, the implementation of crisis management cells in all university hospitals, some changes in managing information feedback, which allowed continuous learning and responsiveness. More generally, we can say that the decision-making process has completely changed, with more and more people from the field being trusted. The direction relied more and more on people in the field at the level of the care unit, and less on experts at the regional or national level. One other very important point was the fact that all direction started a very important communication strategy in order first to fight the fear of the pandemic from people, and also in order to create a shared vision of the work, of the objectives, in order to create more trust between people in the organization. And all this can be linked to a kind of knowledge management strategy, with also a quick identification and analysis of reported error, with greater fluidity of hierarchical relationships, with reinforced circulation of information, and so on. So a real some real changes in the organization of hospital. We think that the purpose of our research is not only to point out some problems, to analyze them, but also to help people on the field dealing with this problem, trying to bring some path towards solutions. So what did we learn from these first interviews? We learned that the context is moving quicker than we thought, and we have to understand that in order to learn from our mistakes, which is the most important thing to do for now. When we speak about mistakes, it's not to find some scapegoats, but to see the COVID-19 as a kind of rehearsal to prepare us to the next systemic crisis. We know it will arrive at one moment, so we have to be prepared. And to be prepared, we have to understand what our problems are. First of all, we think that we lack a safety culture in risk management in the French administration. We lack an understanding of the systemic dimension of the crisis. We lack a forward-looking vision in order to anticipate other crises. We are very keen on keeping the idea of the right solution, looking for the right solution, even if we know that the right solution doesn't exist. And more generally, this crisis allows an awareness of the systemic dimension of crisis in a hyper-connected world. So we know now that the next crisis will be a systemic crisis, and we have to be prepared to this kind of crisis, not a very simple one, but a systemic one. And to be prepared to the next crisis, we have to change our mindset about risk management. Usually, when we speak about risk management, we have in mind a model which is very famous. It's a Swiss cheese model from James Reason, and this model was proposed to explain the occurrence of system failures. According to this model, in a complex system, hazards are prevented from causing problems by a series of barriers. Each barrier has some weaknesses or holes, hence the similarity with the Swiss cheese. And in order to be protected against a problem, we have the habit of adding adding slices of cheese to block the path for problems. And when by chance all holes are aligned, it's the moment when you have a big crisis. And the idea is to prevent it by adding some slice to your organization, to your process. And in this way of thinking, accidents are normal because of the complexity of the reality of the system, and with this kind of mindset, the only way to avoid accident is to add some protection, to add some slices of cheese. But in our hyper-connected world, maybe we have to change our mindset in order to be more aware of the systemic dimension of problems. The systemic dimension of problems leads to uncertainty. Uncertainty is what characterizes a system with all interaction leading to new features, new interaction, and new problems. So, in order to understand the way system work, we have to rely upon some new mindset, some new way of thinking, and the work of Nassim Nicolas Taleb, the Black Swan, may help us changing our mindset. In this work, Taleb speaks about the Black Swan. What is a Black Swan? A Black Swan is an anticipated event which occurs and have very dire consequences. Think about the 9/11 attacks or the pandemic or the subprime crisis and so on. And why Black Swan occurs? Because we have a mindset which allows a Black Swan because of two fallacies, the ludic fallacy and the narrative fallacy. What is the ludic fallacy? According to Taleb, there are two domains in which we can think about risk. The ludic domain, which is set up like a game with clearly defined rules, like a casino, and the real life dimension or domain, where no one knows the rules and you can't determine what variables contribute to what result. The ludic domain is clean, while the real one is messy. Gambling in the domain of the ludic. There are clear rules and you can figure out the odds with math. Real life is systemic. You can't calculate the odds when you set out into the world. And the ludic fallacy occurs when you try to apply ludic risk to the real world, what we are doing very often. And the other fallacy, the narrative fallacy, which is our inclination to create narratives to explain events. And we try to rewrite the history. We try to provide a nice, comforting explanation for something that cannot or should not be explained nicely and comfortably. We try to find scapegoat, for example, in order to explain crisis. And these two biases prevent to be fully prepared to the next systemic crisis. What do we need to be prepared? How do we manage the unexpected? We don't think that it's possible to manage the unexpected, but it's possible to be open to the unexpected, to uncertainty. And in order to do that, we can rely on the work of Carl Weick and Kathleen Sutcliffe about highly reliable organization, HRO. These organizations have 5 features: preoccupation with failure, the idea that errors are quickly identified and dealt with. The second feature is a reluctance to simplify interpretation. With the idea that not to be satisfied with ready-made explanation for errors, and taking into account the systemic dimension of problems. The third feature is sensitivity to operation, which is a constant control of operation, a constant verification of compliance with procedures. The fourth is commitment to resilience, the ability to detect, contain, overcome problems without organizational paralysis. And the last one, deference to expertise, is the idea that during a crisis, decisions are made on the ground and authority is transferred to the people likely to solve the problem. And if we go back to the university hospital we have studied, we can find some of these features in the practices of people in this hospital. So we have now a path to follow in order to improve the way these hospitals are organized. To conclude this presentation, a few words about what to do next. We have just finished a very large survey of patients, and we will start in September a work on training programs for all employees in university hospital in order to improve the awareness of the environment and the sensitivity to the systemic dimension of problems, which is of course a very ambitious prospect, but it seems the right thing to do to be more prepared to the next crisis. Okay, that's it. So I hope it makes sense. Feel free to email me if you have any question. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much for that presentation from France. Our next speaker is Professor Jean-Pierre Cabestan from HKBU, from GIS here. His topic is the COVID-19 crisis and China's changing international role.
All right, so now we're moving from the national setting to an international setting, and question of governance, coordination, and so on have also been big issues for every country in the context of the COVID-19 health crisis. My point here is I'm going to talk about China and China's foreign policy, how much COVID-19 has changed China's foreign policy and international role. And as you can see on this slide, this outline, actually the question relates both to China international policies, but also actions on the one hand, but on the other hand, it relates to outside perceptions of China's policies and actions since the outbreak of the COVID-19 crisis. Many of China's policies and action, actually, particularly what is known as its assertiveness and competition with the US and the West as a whole, by and large, predate the pandemic. The pandemic, in my view, I mean, to summarize what I'm going to say, has highlighted and enhanced China's assertiveness, as well as intensified the Sino-US competition, and to some degree, the emerging Cold War between the two superpowers. So now, COVID-19 could have sort of fostered cooperation among nations. We have another example of that, which is the climate change issue, and in spite of the growing tensions between the US and China, both countries, particularly in the beginning of the Biden administration, have started to cooperate on, or to show intention at least, to cooperate on climate change. In contrast, I have to say, and that's my own perception of the issue, on COVID-19, there's been very little cooperation between China and the rest of the world, and particularly between China and the West. What has happened, actually, it has, as I was saying, intensified frictions and tensions mainly between China and developed countries. Now, one of the other implications, and that's something we can come back to in the discussion of the COVID-19 crisis, is to give China, I think the COVID-19 crisis has given China a window of opportunity to increase its influence in the global south. Now, it's maybe oversimplification of the picture, because there's been a number of cases of pushback in the global south against China, pushbacks which may have started before the COVID-19 crisis, but which have been, again, amplified, I have to say, by the COVID-19 crisis. Okay, briefly, a few words, I mean, for people who are familiar with China's foreign policy, just make a few kind of reminders here about, Xi Jinping's much more ambitious foreign policy, which has really buried for good, I'm sorry, Deng Xiaoping's low-profile policy, 韬光养晦, to replace it by a new formula, which has been actually in place for quite a while now, nearly 10 years, the 分法有为. Now, as illustration of that, the 一带一路, the Belt and Road Initiative, is the best known illustration. But we've seen more assertiveness in a number of areas, including China's maritime domain in the South China Sea, in the East China Sea, which China's pushing, building new artificial islands. I mean, I don't want to spend too much time on that, but more friction with the US and the US government's FONOPS, or freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, but also with Japan around the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. We've seen also more military and political and economic pressure on Taiwan since Tsai Ing-wen re-election, and particularly since her re-election in 2020. And so those actions clearly predate the COVID-19 crisis. We've seen also a more ambitious foreign policy and foreign security policy, which has been pretty much approved and amplified since the 19 Party Congress in 2017, which is, I mean, if I may summarize China's ambition in one word, is China is moving to the central stage, and with the ambition to supplant or to replace the United States in a different maybe capacity, but really to become the big player, the big boss on the world stage. Now, this has been, I mean, in terms of strategy, has been illustrated by what have been called the war warrior diplomacy. I mentioned 2017 because the the movie War Warrior 2 was actually made public. I mean, was distributed in July 2017, and since then there's been a temptation to qualify China's assertiveness, diplomatic assertiveness, as a war warrior diplomacy. Now, all right. Now, more rivalry with the United States. I will go here also rather fast. One of the illustration of this rivalry is in the technological field with the Made in China 2025, launched in 2015, so prior to the COVID-19 crisis. Trump's factor in the equation has been also has been clear and is well known. We see also intensified competition between China and the West, in particular the US, but also Europe and other nations, developed nations in the global South, Southeast Asia, in Africa. Djibouti naval base has been a good example of China's growing outreach in the global South. but also in the Middle East, Latin America, and even in the South Pacific, we've seen a number of moves made by China to the detriment of Taiwan in terms of diplomatic recognitions, but also in order to extend China's, via the Belt and Road Initiative, influence in that part of the world. Now, the trade war between the US and China has also been one of the key factors of this growing rivalry. And but I think on the strategic level, the US Indo-Pacific strategy has clearly also demonstrated the US willingness, which started with the pivot, Obama's pivot in 2011, but with the Indo-Pacific strategy, it's a much more ambitious plan to sort of balance or contain, some people would say, China's rise in the Asia-Pacific, but also in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, we've seen also the Quad being also reactivated. As you can see on the slide, I put Quad Plus because the number of other players which have been associated with the Quad is made of the US, Australia, India, and Japan, but also there is an ambition on the part of the US to include countries like South Korea, which are much more cautious, but also European nations like France, the UK, and maybe Germany to the Quad. And with the recent military exercise between Japan, the US, and France in the Japanese territory is a good illustration of that extension of the Quad, again, to balance China's rise. On human rights, I think issues predated the COVID-19, but I have to mention here that until May, June 2020, the Trump administration didn't have any interest in human rights. It is kind of, the administration woke up pretty late on those issues. So now with the EU, I think I've seen also a more complicated relationship predating the COVID-19. I mean, that's the background of the COVID-19. I think it's important to sort of mention the way the EU has changed its perception of China, its China policy. Now, the catchword which has been remembered by everyone in the world, in particular the media, has been that China now is a systemic rival of the European Union. I've mentioned the whole quotation here to remind everyone that it's also a cooperation partner, a negotiating partner, and an economic competitor. So, I mean, you have to accept the whole thing. It's clear that there's been a number of growing irritants, or irritants which have been around for many years, but which have also manifest themselves more clearly in the last few years. Market access, technology transfer, but also 16+1 annual summit between China and some EU member states from Central and Eastern Europe, but also some non-member states like Serbia meeting every year, and now Greece since 2019. And as an ambition for China to reach out those countries, but also with the consequence to divide the EU and to make the EU a weaker negotiating partner in its relationship with China. Human rights, I think for Europeans have also predated clearly the COVID-19 crisis. I don't mention Hong Kong because Hong Kong popped up later, as you know, with the June 2020 national security law, but dissidents, Tibet and Xinjiang were already pretty important issues for the Europeans. Okay, so what has the COVID-19 crisis changed? And I will first mention China's reaction to the crisis, because the crisis started in Wuhan. As you remember, it's been called the Wu flu by a number of people at the beginning. China tried to dismiss that idea that it was responsible for the crisis, for the pandemic. But we have to admit, as far as we know today, that the pandemic started in China, in Wuhan. Now, China has been has taken advantage of the crisis to go on overdrive, I would say, and the problem with its reaction to the crisis on the international stage is what I call there's been too much overkill. Because China has been very active, but also tried to achieve too many objectives at the same time. And I've mentioned some of them here, as far as I remember in the spring 2020. Now, first of all, China tried to hide what happened between December 2019 and January 23rd, when Xi Jinping decided to impose a lockdown on Wuhan and Hubei. So there was a period of time when China ignored the issue or didn't want to communicate on the issue. And but very quickly after that, it's tried to demonstrate that it was a responsible great power, and demonstrating its generosity to the world in distributing masks and PPEs and so on. Now, but China at the same time minimized the assistance it received in the first place in the initial period of time by the EU and other countries. And also it launched a disinformation campaign on the origin of the virus, claiming that maybe American athletes brought the virus to Wuhan earlier. Now, China also had a number of, offensive objectives, trying to demonstrate that China was a model in the health crisis management, much better than the so-called democratic countries or Western democratic countries. And that has, I have to say, I mean, I'll come down in the next slide, antagonized a number of countries which receive at the same time help from China. But China also, and the international state, I think Courtney is going to talk about that later, has also tried to sort of nurture a very close relationship with the WHO, in spite of a reluctance to provide timely information and let WHO experts investigate, especially in Wuhan. So there's been a lot of actually resistance on the part of China. So, I mean, there's been accusation that China had manipulated the WHO and particularly the Tedros. Well, if you look at the timeline here, it's quite interesting that the WHO only declared the new pandemic, COVID-19, public health emergency, international concern only in the January 30th, a pandemic much later in March. So the WHO was under China pressure to prevent from, to resist any to move to the to the stage of declaring COVID-19 a pandemic. And if you don't remember, you maybe remember that in the first place, China tried to criticize the countries which tried to stop people from China to fly to the US or to Europe. So they were, I mean, China had changed its position later. So now there's been also sources of frictions with other countries regarding the quality of Chinese equipments. China was mixing also aid with sales. We don't know whether China was really generous or was trying to make money with the equipment. So there were a lot of controversies. So as a result, what's happened is that in the spring of 2020, there's been a battle of narratives between China and a number of countries, including Europe. And I mentioned just the case of the Liu Xiaoye. Maybe you don't know who Liu Xiaoye is. The Chinese ambassador to France, who was previously ambassador to Canada, well known for his sharp language. And there was an incident, he criticized the hospital system in France to the point that he was summoned by the French Foreign Minister to the French Foreign Ministry for clarification. So now there's been also problems with some African residents in Canton or Guangzhou today, and accusation of racial discrimination against China. That was a big story in Africa for some time. We can see whether it has sort of been forgotten now, but clearly it created some problems in China-Africa relations, in particular with Nigeria. Now, the question of debt was also an issue on which I think we discussed that yesterday afternoon with some economists. I don't want to say much here, but China was, had to sort of engage with other countries in trying to solve and the G20 in particular, the debt issue. But that led, accusation of against China that the BRI actually had fed the global South debt to China. So that has also implication in terms of China's image in the global South. Now, what I started very early is this competition, not only for aid, but also for vaccine. And, I had predicted that because we saw that with Ebola, we saw that with SARS. Countries and companies tend to compete to find vaccines. And here it's a kind of cutthroat competition. And it's going on. So now, of course, the cooperation with WHO and COVAX has sort of contributed to mitigate those tensions. But I have to mention that COVAX today is mainly providing vaccines manufactured in the West, in the US and Europe. Only very recently, Sinopharm was added to the package of vaccines provided by COVAX and the WHO. Now, at the same time, that's the plus side of in terms of China's influence in the world and the impact of COVID-19. First of all, China has gone out of the COVID-19 crisis ahead of most countries, or all countries, I have to say, thanks to the securitization of the issue on its territory. And I would echo what Vallat said earlier, that security is maybe one of the things that the Chinese leadership is very keen about, and particularly Xi Jinping securitize everything. 全面安全, as we say in Chinese, global security, it involves everything. It goes from health security, Arctic security, and everything. And of course, security within China, and meaning control of the society by the Communist Party. So, and China is in a stronger position, economic situation, as many countries. So it has led to a narrative in China, which you may have heard of, which is in Chinese, 东升西降, which is now the East is rising, the West is declining. This narrative, when we talk about narratives, we've got a good illustration of the Chinese narrative, so which is dominating the domestic stage, at least in China. So I think, by and large, I would say, because of China's activism on the international stage, its influence has, I think, continued to grow in the global South, thanks to COVID-19. It's vaccine diplomacy, as I mentioned. There's been filled up quite a number of gaps and lacks of supply by in many developing countries. And I mean, the recent example of Taiwan is also quite interesting, because it shows that developed countries have first kept the vaccine for themselves, and there is a lack of vaccine, including for countries which can afford to buy them, like Taiwan. But there are many other reasons. But in the case of the global South, China has filled up a gap and has been very good at sort of not only supplying delivering vaccines to a number of countries, which are mentioned here, 80 countries, 53 for free, but also making a lot of publicity about that vaccine diplomacy. It's been very good at PR, I would say today, public relations. On the debt relief, also, China has demonstrated a willingness to reschedule debt and to some degree to cancel debt, and that's new for China. And I mentioned the figure of for Angola, DRC, and Zambia, for instance. So in China, by and large, I mean, that's a new trend. I mean, that's not really new, but that's really, COVID-19 has been amplified. It wants to be seen as the lead of the South, the lead of the world silent majority. And you see that with the China's activities in the UN system. We speak in the name of the people who are not, but in terms of number of countries, we speak for the majority. Okay, so now, how much time do I have left? 5 minutes. Oh, that's fine. Okay, just wanted to mention the COVID impact, because we've got some surveys, and one of the best surveys was the Pew Center survey, published in October 2020 and conducted, I think, in the summer, July 2020. The only limitation which is mentioned here, which is a big one actually, is that the 14 nations surveyed are all developed nations. Asian, European, and American nations. I mean, Northern American nations, Australia. So you've seen figures clearly, and the view of China is more unfavorable now. And there's an assumption that China has done a bad job dealing with the outbreak, which is very persistent in the West. But I think the top is Japan, Australia, France is low. Italy is the only country in Western Europe which where the people in favor of, we think that China's done a good job, overtake it's 51 against 49. So and there's a correlation between countries or people who think that China does a good job and people who are more confident in Xi Jinping, which is quite interesting in terms of anyway. Now, I think by and large in the US, the COVID-19 has contributed to deteriorating China's image in America, and we've seen that with the passing of the baton between the Trump and the Biden administration. The Biden administration has not changed what's so much its policy towards China. There is one area where the as I mentioned at the beginning, the U.S. administration ready to cooperate with China is climate change. But in COVID-19, I don't see much cooperation. That's what is interesting. Actually, I see more competition for vaccines, and competition also in the global south, because, you know, that's not the other story. China has taken advantage of the lack of supply, but now the Biden administration decided to supply more vaccines to the south. So the competition is going on, which is maybe a good thing for the south after all. Now, but the final competition is more ideological, what I call an ideological battle between authoritarian China and democracy, and that will also carry on. And in the EU, I think there is also growing distrust of China in the EU, and the COVID-19 crisis has spurred the EU's growing dissatisfaction with China, and issues of like human rights become even more prominent, not only because of what's happening in Xinjiang with the 1 million Uyghur put into concentration camp without any judgment, without due process of law, but also because of what's happening in Hong Kong. But all those things have been amplified again by the COVID-19 context. So we're leading to the freeze of the comprehensive accord investigation. Accord on investment, which the freeze of its ratification today, and because the number of MPs EU MPs have been the target of counter sanctions of the part of China, and now it's that's make the ratification quasi impossible. So there are some exceptions, which I mentioned here in the EU, being the best known one being Hungary, but by and large, the EU has now a more negative view of China. So my conclusion is, as such, I think we have to bear in mind that the COVID-19 crisis has not fundamentally changed China's international role. The trends at play were already there before, but the pandemic has intensified tensions and irritants, deteriorating China's image, especially in the north. Now we'll see, the pandemic has given this opportunity I mentioned earlier, to contribute to what has been called by others the global commons, but the competition with other great powers, I think, is going on, and I see here, I think, a rivalry which is also part of this new Cold War, which have many differences with the old Cold War, but which is also made of geostrategic rivalry, economic competition, technological competition, and also ideological contradictions between democracy and dictatorship. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next presentation continues on the same theme, and we will also continue the musical chairs here, as I see. Our next presenter is Dr. Emily Tran, here also at Hong Kong Baptist University, GIS. Her topic is comparative perspectives of China's health diplomacy in Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here in this conference. Thank you for all of my colleagues who have organized it, and my department head, Alistair Cole. I'm delighted to be in this panel with David Vallat and Jean-Pierre Cabestan, and of course, Courtney and Mr. Lam. So this topic very much echoes what Jean-Pierre has already presented, and we will try to go to elaborate a bit further. So the talk today is actually the reflection of several talks that I have already delivered for the Brookings Institution, Chatham House, and the Doha Forum between June 2020 and May 2021. So it's been basically over a year that I've been working on this China's health diplomacy in the MENA region, so that is in the Middle East and North Africa. And these various talks of mine have been reflected in two publications upcoming, one in the Journal of Contemporary China, specifically on China's health a Silk Road in the MENA, in a shifting world order, and another one that is a book chapter, 2 publications on China's health diplomacy, and a co-authored with Professor Yahya Zubir. So China's health Silk Road, this is something that has been very prominent in the news, and we have said a lot of things. Jean-Pierre mentioned about the battle of narratives, and indeed it was basically a battle of narratives, of image and of tweets, so very prominent all over the world. Okay. So just to go very briefly about the foundation. So just to remind us that China's health diplomacy just did not pop up all of a sudden in spring 2020. It goes back much before in various foundations. So first of all, there is a whole narrative built up, and this whole narrative of China's health diplomacy was built up, in the aftermath of the foundation of the PRC, especially when China in the 1950s was not a developing country, was rather poor country, but already was developing this health diplomacy worldwide. And of course, the goal was already to gain friends and to make friends worldwide, especially in Africa. And we have several authors, of course, in a rich literature that have documented this China health diplomacy. In the contemporary time, of course, China has also in the 1980s, 1990s, and more prominently, as Jean-Pierre mentioned, with the Ebola crisis, has stepped up its foreign diplomacy and also its health diplomacy. And that has been done under its South-South cooperation, as mentioned by Jean-Pierre. Indeed, China, in its new role, wants to be seen as a South-South collaborator, and actually today as a South leader, South developing nations leader. And we have a lot of discourses, speeches made by President Xi Jinping who have reflected this. Of course, all this is not only in words, and we can see that in sub-Saharan Africa, especially, Chinese have built a number of hospitals, a number of health centers, have sent hundreds of doctors. China has been the only country that has done research and development to develop a Ebola vaccine, because for other pharmaceutical companies, Ebola being a disease contained in a certain region of the world was not very interesting in terms of return on investment to develop. So China was the only one. And because of all these good deeds, China has been seen indeed as the leader of the South. So now, more recently, since the mid-2010s, China has shifted its health diplomacy into the health Silk Road. And so China has merged the Belt and Road Initiative with its health diplomacy, coming up with this new term of a health Silk Road. And basically, China's thinking was to say that along with the moving of goods and along the supply chains that starts with China and ends in Europe and the Americas, or Africa, basically, they have to be also moving of diseases and so on. So it was basically put into this Belt and Road Initiative. A lot of people actually overlooked this part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but there is a lot included about the health Silk Road. Of course, it is not only for the good of mankind, it is not only for a good deed, but it is also for exporting. You know, that there is an idea of a trade and exporting Chinese medicines and Chinese medical supplies. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has provided China with a unseen opportunity, unexpected opportunity to deploy its health Silk Road. And we have seen all over the world China's medical supplies being shipped as far as Europe, for example. So all these not only initiated by the states, but also by different regions and companies of China. Going now to the Middle East and North Africa states, so that is called the MENA. What I showed you here, you know, it's the year 2006. So you have already a lot of forum organized within the China-Africa Forum. And in those forums, China has a lot emphasized indeed the commitment for health. So we talked about Ebola, but also the commitment of China to fight against malaria. And again, all these have been demonstrated in the literature. You see here teams of Chinese doctors operating in Africa. So there is a big literature highlighting the magnitude of China's health aid to the African continent. And of course, there is equally a big literature highlighting the limits of this China's help to the African continent as well. So what we want to demonstrate, and what I have been trying to say in the past talks and publications here, is really that the MENA, so maybe the Middle East and North Africa, has not been such a playground for China up to the COVID-19. And the COVID-19 has allowed China to maybe move to another region, so to move north of the Sahara and to deploy its health secret into the Arab states and Arab-speaking states. And we have seen that this deployment of China's health silk road in the MENA has led to this battle of narratives. And one of the main stakeholders of this battle of narrative has been, of course, Global Times, which is China now becoming official media. And Global Times has been very good. And, you know, the battle of narrative has evolved into a very sophisticated communication with a lot of very well done infographics, as you can see here. And basically the numbers that are there, they are all verifiable. So it's not fake news, you know, it's real data, but twisted in a way that, of course, makes China looks very good. And indeed, China does look very good. And even Global Times, you know, is trying to be a good player and has been a good player by acknowledging at the same time the solidarity coming from Europe. So when China was under attack by European states because of the World War diplomacy, Global Times wanted to say to Europe, but first the solidarity came from European states, and CGTN and both Global Times did emphasize this first step of solidarity from European states to China. Of course, the idea behind this was to try to contain the virus within China and not become a pandemic. So when the epicenter of the outbreak shifted from China to Europe and then to the Americas, of course, as we have seen, the EU and the US have adopted a inward-looking posture, and that's why China was very much prominent and had this opportunity to deploy its health diplomacy at the same moment when the EU was basically lacking intra-EU solidarity, and a lot of states actually did comment on also the lack of intra-EU solidarity in the first months of the epidemic. And of course, I'm not going to go back to all this ensued warfare narrative and aggressive messages of Chinese diplomatic missions. And Mr. Lu Xiaoye, the Chinese ambassador to Paris, has been a very prominent figure in this battle of narratives. There have been also a number of comments about the poor quality or the default of Chinese medical supplies. And although actually China has addressed that very rapidly, it has gone quite unseen, unnoticed in the media. So somehow, you know, this battle of narrative is not only from the Chinese side, but also the European media and Western media at large have not been entirely neutral or objective. Now let's look into the reactions from the MENA and Europe with regards to this deployment of a Chinese health diplomacy. So we have conducted content analysis of media and speeches in Arabic, English, French, and Chinese languages. And we have seen that overall, really overall, in the MENA, the population and the government have been highly positive and praised China for its aid. And the word all-weather friendship has come back many, many times, highlighting the solid economic ties. Of course, this is the political level, but when we have seen, also we have studied the opinion polls that have been conducted throughout the MENA states, and when the opinion polls, I will come back to this later on Europe, when the opinion polls in Europe, and as mentioned by Jean-Pierre, has shown actually overall negative sentiments and falling down of China's soft power, in the MENA, opinion polls has seen a high increase, popular increase towards China with this. So we have seen on Facebooks and Twitter, you know, people just praising China, admiring China, showing Chinese women at work and in different kind of situation, showing Chinese women liberated. So you see that in this part of the world, you know, they have different values and they look at China as really a modern country and a leading country of the South. So we have also the MENA states that have appropriated for themselves the Chinese concept. So they have made theirs the Chinese narrative of shared values, of common destiny, and very few have indeed criticized China. So with regards to this development, we have seen that China's footprint into the MENA, that was relatively limited, and that existed, of course, and that was documented, including by Jean-Pierre here on this panel. China's footprint in this part of the world has increased, and China has taken this opportunity to, with a lot of agility, basically gain hearts and minds in this part of the world. So when I was talking about the battle of narrative and the infographics made by Global Times, and here are two other examples of the vaccine diplomacy and also how much China has exported vaccines. So not all of them are donations, of course, but this is not what is claimed here. And some of them are actually sold vaccines. So you see that China indeed has exported quite a number and has been leading in exporting vaccines. And it is true that China in the first few months of the vaccine diplomacy has played a bilateral game that is basically seeing as a South-South collaborator and exporting its vaccine as a donation or as selling products to countries. But now China has recently joined the WHO program and has contributed also through multilateral means. So you see, but there was this attempt from China to be seen as a leader in the first weeks. So now the reaction from Europe. What I want here to highlight is that in Europe, the image was really different, and it was very differently received for various reasons, some of which have been highlighted by Jean-Pierre and myself at the beginning of this talk. So I'd like to go into more the perceptions of Europe and how this perception of in Europe towards China has evolved. So I'd like to identify here three levels of perceptions: the political level, the civil society level, and of course the popular level, and how this pandemic has changed the perception of China. At the political level, we can see actually 5 factors, 5 layers, or as David Vallat put it, 5 slices of cheese. I wouldn't say Swiss cheese because he showed a cheese with holes, and the cheese with holes is actually a French cheese, so not a Swiss one. Adding to these layers, we have actually a new context, and David Vallat mentioned, obstacles to restore trust. So at a time when leaders, and we have studied the discourses, speeches of leaders, the number of times the word trust has come back in the official speeches of Mr. Macron, Mrs. Merkel, Jean-Claude Juncker, and also Mr. Xi Jinping is quite incredible. So the number of times the word trust comes, and actually the more times the word trust comes into their speeches and the least trust we see in real facts. So we have these cumulative layers of obstacles. First, the language. So, of course, the language has changed a lot in the EU, and we can come back to this later on in the Q&A if we have time. The language also with the pandemic that has added an extra layer. So, the language, as shown by Jean-Pierre Cabestan before, has already evolved in 2018, but now with the pandemic, it has evolved even further. The COVID-19 pandemic has made this battle of narrative being more even prominent and sharpen, make the language even more aggressive, even on the European side. Of course, we have the comprehensive agreement on investment that is now dead, basically, since the last night officially. So it took 7 years for the two parties to negotiate this deal. And, you know, in just 3 months, it was announced, you know, on December 30th that it was to be done, to be ratified. And now we are in May, and it is now dead. So, and of course, this with the Xinjiang and Uyghur questions that has led to another battle of narratives throughout the world, especially in Europe and between China. Hong Kong has been another extra layer, another slice of cheese, adding to this, you know, context. The EU Foreign Affairs Council was to actually vote a motion to condemn what has been happening in Hong Kong, especially with regards to the national security law. But there was one EU member who did not agree. And this motion was basically taken out from the EU agenda. And that one country is, of course, as we know, Hungary. And then we have the Indo-Pacific strategy that was an initiative from France, the Netherlands, and Germany. And now this Indo-Pacific strategy that was said to be a counter strategy towards China's influence in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean has basically grown into a much bigger project with many more partners in it. And it is becoming indeed an anti-China strategy. So at the civil society level, I'd like just to mention this marvelous work from Rogeria and Tsimonis, two scholars from King's College that have who have written a 30-page study on, you know, Chinese economics presence in Europe and how the different think tanks in European countries, so they have studied over 30 think tanks reports, and all the think tanks reports of these European countries have presented the Chinese increasing presence, economic presence in Europe in a security type of perspective. So again, very interesting study that shows what the think tanks think and how the think tanks have reports have influenced the shifting narrative of European leaders. So very interesting with the civil society. And at the popular level, we have, of course, the Pew Research. But with Europe in particular, we have another project that is the Sinophone Borderland Project that have surveyed close to 19,000 Europeans in 13 European countries. And overall, really overall, the sentiment towards China has gone very, very negative, with Sweden being the most prominent negative against China, with, of course, Western, Northern European democracies being very negative against China. Even countries from Central and Eastern Europe that were seen to be more close to China in the mid-2010s have moved and are now overall expressing negative sentiments towards China. And even the Visegrad countries have expressed more negative sentiments. So you see that all these studies have shown a growing dissatisfaction with China today. So to conclude, basically, China has started its foreign diplomacy, deploying a health diplomacy, and China was not the only one. You know, countries such as Turkey, such as France, such as the UK have their own, even Cuba, even India have their own health diplomacy, including Saudi Arabia. So China was not alone in deploying its health diplomacy. It is true that the COVID-19 has provided China the opportunity to step up its health diplomacy in countries, in regions that were not very used to Chinese presence with regards to this new role of a global health leader and a new role that China wants to play. There has been some backlash, and China has lost some grounds, especially in Europe, but in the MENA, actually the picture is rather different and rather positive. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for that presentation.